All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Andrey. I administer the Ukrainian Studies Program at the Harriman Institute, Columbia University. Thank you all for joining us today for a very special event entitled Encounter, the Ukrainian Jewish Literary Prize and Other Developments in Ukrainian Literature. Our event today is co-sponsored by the Ukrainian Studies Program at the Harriman Institute and the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. Before we get to our event and to our speakers, I just want to make a few technical notes about other events that we have already organized for this semester, and links to them, to most of them, should be posted also in this broadcast. So on October 18th, we have a film discussion. It's being organized by our Ukrainian Film Club of Columbia University, and it'll be a conversation with young filmmakers Katerina Hornostai and Nikon Romanchenko, and this will be moderated by our own Yuri Shevchuk. Please go to the website, the Harriman website, to see how you can sign up for that and view these films. On November 8th, we have a book talk with Mikhailo Vinitsky. The book is Ukraine's Maidan, Russia's War, a chronicle and analysis of the Revolution of Dignity, and that's at noon. On November 30th at noon, we have a talk by Miroslav Shkandry, who is visiting us at Harriman this semester. His talk is entitled Wellsprings of David Burluk's Art, exploring his enduring inspiration from Kahoka to New York. And then another event on December 9th at noon, a talk by Katerina Yakovenko entitled Memory Battles and Ukrainian Contemporary Art. And our discussion there will be our own Olena Martinyuk. So please go to the Harriman website to get information about those events. Some of those events will be online only, and some will be in a hybrid mode because we are allowed to have some events in person for Columbia folk, but it will also be online. So all the information will be there. As far as today's event, we will have opening remarks by Natalia Fedushchak, our co-sponsors, Ukrainian Jewish Encounter's communication director. Then we'll have a reading by Ukrainian writer Vasyl Makhno in Ukrainian of excerpts of his from his award-winning novel Vichny Kalendar, The Eternal Calendar, which received the 2020 Encounter Ukrainian Jewish Literary Prize. And I will read English translations of these excerpts. And then fellow Ukrainian writer Andrey Kurkov, who served as the head of the jury for the 2020 prize, will discuss the Encounter Prize and other recent developments in Ukrainian literature. After that, you'll get a chance to pose questions to us, which I will read out loud to our guests and will be included in our discussion. This will be recorded and available for viewing later as well. I do want to thank Ukrainian Jewish Encounter for co-sponsoring this event, and to Columbia's Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies for helping spread the word about it as well. So now I'll introduce our participants in order, and then I will pass along the word to Natalia Fedushchak. Vasyl Makhno is a Ukrainian poet, writer, playwright, and essayist who recently participated in a unique literary residence in S.Y. Agnon's hometown Buchach and contributed to the volume Light on the Hills, in which he describes his acquaintance with Agnon's work and his meeting with Emuna Yaron, Agnon's daughter. Makhno is the author of 13 collections of poetry, including Winter Letters and Other Poems, and most recently, Poet, The Ocean and Fish. He has also published the novel The Eternal Calendar and books of essays and literary criticism. His books have been published in Germany, Israel, Poland, Romania, Serbia, and the US. Andrey Kurkov is Ukraine's most widely translated author. He has published over 20 novels, including the best-selling Death and the Penguin, 10 books for children, and about 20 documentary, fiction, and TV movie scripts. His most recent novel to appear in English is Gray Bees, which is a timely and imaginative look at the current Russian-Ukrainian war, told through the prism of the author's signature surrealistic humor. Kurkov is president of PEN Ukraine, which is a branch of the Worldwide Association of Writers, founded in London in 1921, which promotes friendship and intellectual cooperation among writers everywhere. And Natalia Fedushchak, who has roots in the Harriman Institute as a Columbia University as well, is communications director of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, our co-sponsor today, and I will pass along the microphone to you.
Oh, hello, everybody, and thank you, Marco. Before we begin, I'd like to say a few words about Ukrainian Jewish Encounter and the Encounter Prize. UJE is a Canadian charitable nonprofit organization, and we were founded in 2008 with the goal of strengthening mutual comprehension and solidarity between Ukrainians and Jews. These are two peoples who have lived on the territory of modern-day Ukraine for over a millennium. Over the years, we have supported a number of activities, including academic conferences, cultural exchanges, a writer's residence in Buchach, which was just mentioned, a book publication, and literary festivals. These activities have offered participants an opportunity to engage in a broad interethnic dialogue by discussing ideas and publications that have been supported by our organization. And a natural outgrowth of our activities is the Encounter Prize. The prize was announced in 2019, and it aims to build on the common experiences of Ukrainians and Jews over the centuries, expressed in literature and nonfiction. The prize is awarded annually to the most influential work published in Ukraine in the Ukrainian language, in literature and nonfiction, in alternate years that foster Ukrainian Jewish understanding and help solidify Ukraine's place as a multi-ethnic society and gives truth to the motto of our organization: our stories are incomplete without each other. As was mentioned, Vasyl Makhno was the first winner of the Encounter Prize. This year's winner in the nonfiction category was Yohanan Petorsky-Stern's with the Ukrainian language translation of his book, The Anti-Imperial Choice, The Making of the Ukrainian Jew. I mean, I'm so happy for today's panel discussion, and I wanted to say that I'm particularly grateful to Andrey Kurkov, who was instrumental in helping shape the ideas and the guidelines for the Encounter Prize, and was the head of the first international jury of this prize. So I invite everybody to visit our website, UkrainianJewishEncounter.org, to visit our YouTube page and our Facebook page, and I look forward to today's discussion. So,
thank you, Natalia. So we will now move on, and Vasyl Makhno will be reading excerpts from this award-winning novel, and I will be reading translations that were made by another of Columbia's alumni. Yes, so I was thinking a more nicer word, but alumni certainly, Ali Kinsella. And just recently, the Peterson Literary Fund at BCU Foundation has awarded Ali Kinsella a translation in progress grant for the completed translation from Ukrainian to English of Vasyl Makhno's Vichny Kalendar, and it is a solid amount of work, as you see. It is a big book, so it is a translation certainly in progress. So Vasyl, please read, and then I'll read Ali's translation.
Okay, first of all, I would like to say thank you, Marco and Natalia and Andrey, for this event and presentation these awards and excerpt from my novel. That in the present time we have only translated only first part of this book, and I will be read that's the first chapter. Розпочинається наша історія із того, що восени 5426 року від створення світу і 1666 року від Різдва Христового і 1115 року за вірменським літочисленням і 1076 року мусульманського календаря Гіджри з порту міста Ізмір відплила галера Баштарда. Подія, на котру можна було б не звернути уваги, якби цією галерою плив до Стамбула хтось інший, а не Саботай Цві, ізмірський мешканець, який оголосив світові про своє месіанство. Надходили роки, у які тривожно вчитувалися юдейські книжники та християнські богослови, щоби зрозуміти, що чекає цей світ. А очікували вони приходу Месії та кінця світу. Ось чому не стихали суперечки по синагогах бо книжники, йдучи за кожною літерою Тори, послинюючи пальці, розвивали сувої пергаменту, аби збагнути слова спершу очима, а відтак розумом. А християнські богослови, такі як Йоанникій і Галятовський, були переконані, що лише християни дотримуються закону Мойсея, тому будуть спасенні. Астрономи вдивлялися в зоряне небо, вишукуючи звізди й небесні знамення, щоби першими помітити що-небудь, що підказало б їм вістку про останні часи. Бо відомо, що перед останніми часами прийдуть лжемесії, війни, голод, хвороби, потопи, і настане велике збаламучення всіх народів. У Лондоні, до прикладу, тоді бушувала чума, завезена голландськими купцями. Клерк королівського адміралтейства Семюел Пипс у щоденнику описуватиме, що після наказу влади знищити всіх псів і котів, ареал епідемії розширився. Ціле літо міські пацюки розносили смертельну хворобу, а мешканці Лондона виносили трупи з домів і складали на вулицях, бо не було їх чим вивозити на цвинтарі. І тільки на початку вересня королівський пекар забув загасити піч, у якій випікав хліб для двору, і вигоріло тоді півміста. Разом із будинками згоріли й переносники хвороби, і усі, хто покинув Лондон, повернулися. І вершилися тоді по світу також події, про які забулося, і тому ми їх теж не зможемо згадати. А той Сабтай-Цві, який поділить світ на 26 частин, про що розповімо згодом, для своїх послідовників зовсім не переймався, що імперії та королівства давно володіють тим, що він так легко роздавав. Османська і Римська імперії, Іспанія і Португалія, Московське царство і династія Цін у Китаї, відречення патріарха Никона і відкриття гравітації Ісаком Ньютоном, англо-данська війна і перша, друкована Біблія вірменської в Амстердамі. Ось чому все, що пов'язано невидимими нитками історії, жило тоді в очікуванні останніх часів. Бо останні часи завжди з нами.
Our story begins in the autumn of the 5,426 years since the creation of the world, the year of our Lord 1666, the year 1115 according to the Armenians, and 1076 in the Islamic calendar of the Hijri era, when Agalia Bastarda sailed from the port city of Smyrna. It was an event that could easily have been overlooked if someone other than Sabotage, resident of Smyrna, who had proclaimed his messianship to the world, had sailed on this galley to Istanbul. The years had come that the Jewish scribes and Christian theologians were peering into in order to understand what awaited this world. They were waiting for the coming of the Messiah and the end of times. Hence, the quarrels in the synagogues couldn't be quelled, for the scribes, following along with every letter of the Torah and licking their fingers, unfurled their scrolls of parchment to grasp the words first with their eyes and only then with their minds. The Christian theologians, such as Yoniki Galatovsky, were convinced that only Christians upheld the laws of Moses and would therefore be saved. Astronomers peered into the starry skies looking for divine signs so that they could be the first to notice anything that might hint at some news of the end of the world. It was known that before the end of times, there would come false messiahs, wars, hunger, disease, and floods, and that great mayhem would reign all over the people. In London, for example, the plague raged, brought by Dutch merchants. Chief Secretary to the Admiralty Samuel Pepys writes in his diary that after the Crown's order to put down all the dogs and cats, the range of the plague expands. All summer, the city's rats spread the fatal disease, while the inhabitants of London carried corpses from their homes and piled them up in the streets because there were no cars to take them to the cemeteries. It was only at the start of September that the royal baker forgot to extinguish the oven he was baking bread in for the court, and half the city burned down. Along with the buildings, the carriers of the disease also burned, and everyone who'd evacuated London. There were some other events around the world that everyone has forgotten, so we cannot recall them here. But that Sabotage, who divided the world into 26 parts, there'll be more on that later, offering them to his followers, was not in the least concerned that empires and kingdoms had long possessed what he was so easily giving away. The Ottoman and Roman empires, Spain and Portugal, the Tsardom of Muscovy, the Qing dynasty in China, Patriarch Nikon's abdication, and Isaac Newton's discovery of gravity, the gunboat war between the English and the Kingdom of Denmark, and the first Armenian Bible published in Amsterdam. Everything that is connected by the invisible threads of history lived then in anticipation of the end of times, because the end of the times are always with us.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And next excerpt from the novel. Так ось, одного разу приїхав до Абідоса кабаліст Нехемія Га Коен зі Львова. Їхав він через польську та угорські землі, а пробувши 2 місяці на Балканах, дістався Стамбула. Там випитав про Сабатаєць свій і подався зі столиці на південь, до Дарданельської протоки. 3 дні та 3 ночі проговорили вони, Нехемія Га Коен із Сабатаєм Цві. І бачив Нехемія Га Коен, у яких розкошах перебуває Сабатай Цві, що їсть і що п'є з дружиною Сарою. Спочатку Машіах поцікавився, звідки Нехемія прибув до нього, і почув, що зі Львова, землі польської. По містечках у тій землі багато живе юдеїв, розповідав Нехемія, які чули про Машіаха і хочуть дізнатися, коли ж їм повертатися до Єрусалима. Другого дня продовжували вони свою розмову. Бачу, сказав Нехемія Га Коен, що ти живеш як цар. Сабатай Цві посміхнувся. Але чи вийдеш із цієї тюрми, аби збулося обіцяне тобою народу Ізраїлевому? Чому ти питаєш мене, чи вийду з цієї тюрми, якщо знаєш, що Машіах мусить бути погорджуваний людьми і гнаний ворогами своїми? Питаюся, бо читав листи Натана з Гази про те, що зі Стамбула почнеться ісход юдейський до Єрусалима. То питаю тебе, коли? І ще один лист надійшов до нас. У ньому говорилося про те, що Машіях в'їхав на Левові до султана, і той віддав свою корону. То де вона? Не сподобалися ці запитання Сабатаєві, і відповів він Нехемії: хто ти такий, щоби мене питати? А якщо ти не відповісиш на ці запитання, то я буду тебе питати, хто ти такий.
One morning, the Kabbalist Nehemiah HaKohen from Lviv arrived in Abydos. Having traveled through Polish and Hungarian lands and spent 2 months in the Balkans, he finally reached Istanbul. There he asked about Shabbatai Tzvi and went south out of the capital to the Dardanelles. Nehemiah HaKohen and Shabbatai Tzvi spoke for 3 days and 3 nights. Nehemiah HaKohen saw what luxury Shabbatai Tzvi was surrounded by, that he ate and drank with his wife Sarah. At first, the Mashiach inquired as to where Nehemiah had come from. He heard from Lviv, Polish lands. Many Jews live in the towns of that land, Nehemiah explained, who had heard about the Mashiach and wanted to find out when they could return to Jerusalem. They continued their conversation on the 2nd day. I see, said Nehemiah HaKohen, that you live like a king. Shabbatai Tzvi smiled. But will you get out of this jail to fulfill your promises to the people of Israel? Why are you asking me if I'll get out of this jail if you know that the Mashiach must be despised by people and persecuted by his enemies? I'm asking because I read Nathan of Gaza's letters about how the Jewish exodus to Jerusalem will begin in Istanbul. So I'm asking you when. Yet another letter reached us. It says that the Mashiach rode on a lion to the Sultan who gave him his crown. So where is it? Shabbatai Tzvi didn't like these questions. He answered Nehemiah, who are you to ask me such questions? And if you can't answer these questions, I will ask you, who are you?
And next and last excerpt. Саме в той час, коли Сабатай Цві плив галерою Баштардою до Стамбула, звістка про Машіяха дійшла і до Язлівця. Привезли її голландські юдеї. Вони розповіли все, що знали самі, а знали вони не більше від язловецьких. Однак листи Натана з Гази давно читали в амстердамських синагогах, і прихід Машіаха обговорювався там по усіх юдейських домах. Отож поїхали ті голландські купці у Волощину і залишили Язловецьким вістку, яка швидко передавалася з уст в уста і зробила велике збурення в Язлівці. Після від'їзду юдеїв з Амстердама Язловецькі сходилися до синагоги і до свіданку говорили про Машіаха, молилися, засинали, кладучи під голови книжки. Дехто казав, що потрібно їм, язловецьким юдеям, готуватися в дорогу до Єрусалима. І щоб швидше дістатися, то все майно треба спродати. Інші пропонували дочекатися, коли амстердамські купці вертатимуться з Волощини, щоб розплатати їх більше. Коли звістку про Машіаха підтвердили й бучицькі юдеї, до яких один лист з Натана з Гази, переписаний у Відні, привіз Мошко, торгівець прянощами, то послали вони служку до синагоги, щоб той привіз їм того листа. Служка поїхав до Бучича і привіз. Читали той лист кілька днів. І два рабини підтвердили, що спасіння народу Ізраїлового надходить. Але не знали язловецькі юдеї, що чинити далі. І тому вирішили дочекатися повернення амстердамських купців, але про них уже й 2 місяці й чутки не було. І коли новий лист Натана з Гази про Машіаха, який пливе до Стамбула, щоб звідти розпочати повернення юдеїв на святу землю, потрапив до рук язловецького рабина, вирішили язловецькі переготуватися до відходу з цієї землі, на якій були уже 2 століття. Можливо, півроку по тому почули вони, що варшавський кабаліст Нехемія Га-Коен збирається до Стамбула, в якому на той час перебував Сабтай-Цвій, щоб побачити його і переконатися, що Машіах справжній. Язловецькі також вирішили вислати 2 своїх до столиці Порти. І опанували їх радість і безтурботність, готувалися до відходу, тому співали псалми і танцювали на вулицях, привертаючи увагу християн. А Барух, який вділяв щорічну 10-ту частину на синагогу, тепер уже на радощах обдаровував всіх, хто потрапляв йому на очі. А коли 2 язловецьких юдеїв, Ашер і Нахум, вирушили на зустріч Машіяхові, то за митницею, вже на волоському шляху, наздогнала їх ніч. І вони ніколи не повернулися до Язлівець. Може, згинули в дорозі? Хто знає?
Precisely when Sabotage was sailing on the Galia Bastarda to Istanbul, words of the Mashiach reached Yazlovets brought by Dutch Jews. They told everything that they themselves knew, but they knew no more than those in Yazlovets. However, Nathan of Gaza's letters had been read long ago in the synagogues of Amsterdam, and the Mashiach's arrival had been discussed in all the Jewish homes there. So when these Dutch merchants went to Wallachia, they left a message for those in Yazlovets that quickly passed from mouth to mouth and caused a great commotion there. After the Jews from Amsterdam had left, the people of Yazlovets gathered in the synagogues until morning, talked about the Mashiach, prayed and slept, placing books under their heads. Some said that they, the Yazlovets Jews, needed to prepare for their journey to Jerusalem, and to get there faster, they should sell all their belongings. Others suggested waiting until the Amsterdam merchants returned from Wallachia to ask them more questions. When the Buchach Jews, to whom Moshko, the spice dealer, had brought a letter from Nathan of Gaza, copied in Vienna, also confirmed the news of the Mashiach, they sent an attendant from the synagogue to bring them the letter. The attendant went to Buchach and brought it back. They read and reread the letter for several days, and 2 rabbis confirmed that the salvation of the people of Israel was upon them. But the Yazlovets Jews did not know what to do next, so they decided to wait for the return of the Amsterdam merchants. But 2 months went by without a word from them. When Nathan of Gaza's new letter about the Mashiach, who was sailing to Istanbul in order to begin the return of the Jews to the Holy Land, reached the lands of the Yazlovets rabbi, they decided to get ready to leave the lands they had inhabited for 2 centuries. Some 6 months later, they heard that the Lviv Kabbalist Nehemiah HaKohen was headed to Istanbul, where Shabbatai Tzvi was then staying in order to see him and make sure he was the true Mashiach. In Yazlovets, they also decided to send 2 of their own to the capital of the Sublime Porte. Their joy and carefreeness were overwhelming, for they were preparing to leave. They sang psalms and danced in the streets, attracting the attentions of Christians. And Baruch, who had already appropriated his annual tithe to the synagogue, was now apportioned his annual tithe to the synagogue, was now joyfully giving gifts to everyone he came across. When the two Yazilevitch Jews, Asher and Nahum, set out to meet the Mashiach, night caught up with them after they had passed Mitnitza and were already on the Wallachian trail. And they never returned to Yazilevitz. Maybe they perished on the way. Who knows? So thank you, Vasyl, for these excerpts.
Thank
Again,
you.
these are excerpts from the award-winning novel Eternal Calendar, Vichny Kalendar, which received the first Encounter prize. And one of the head of the jury, I believe, won the prize, Andrey Kurkov. I would like to ask you to comment on this novel and why it's so important and was given this prize.
Well, first of all, I'm very grateful that I was invited to be head of the jury. And I should say that this was the first experience in my life when I was watching and following the development and the creation of this prize, behind which the main driving force was Natalia Fedushak. And unexpectedly, we had a huge response when the call for books was done. And we had a great number of very interesting books, including collections of poems and short stories. And I think sometimes Ukrainian critics don't realize and don't, I would say, just don't discuss the topics of the Ukrainian fiction. This prize and this selection allowed also me to see and to understand what Ukrainian writers are writing about without being asked to write about. So, I mean, this is a natural Ukrainian literature, and the topics are natural for Ukraine. And the number of the books about Jewish-Ukrainian relationship just shows that actually the presence of Jewish culture, Jewish history in Ukrainian history is very important, and it is a daily occurrence. And I'm sure the writers are writing more now on this topic, and there are books which were written 10 or 20 years ago where you can find the same topic, the same themes. Ukraine was always a very tolerant society. And now this prize is very important because it underlines the importance of tolerance in the times when we have a war in Donbass and we have a next Crimea. And we have partially radicalization of the society. This book obviously is an epic novel. I mean, it's more than a family saga. It's I mean, from the very first chapter, you see that the events take place in different parts of the world. And all these events are united, and the center of the events, it can be found on Ukrainian territory, in Yazlivtsi. And the characters of different nations are interacting in this history. I'm very surprised until today by the knowledge that Vasyl Makhno needed to create this book. And of course, the shortlist for first Encounter Prize was very high quality, but this book was of extra quality for me. And although the number of the characters and the number of micro stories which are present in the book doesn't allow me to remember everything, but I was submersed in the story, and I wish I could see a Netflix series based on this novel, and I'm sure there would be probably about 10 seasons to cover all the events in the book. I think with this book, actually, the Encounter Prize reached immediately from the very beginning a very high plank of quality. And the second nonfiction book by Yohanan Petrovsky-Stern just shows that actually we are capable with the quality of the literature in Ukraine and outside Ukraine, but about Ukrainian Jewish relationship, we are capable to keep this quality level on the highest level. Yeah, and Vasyl Makhno, thanks to this book, I know his book was also in long list for nonfiction prize, 1 of 10. So I mean, he became one of the most important names in contemporary Ukrainian literature, and showed that actually even living in Ukraine, you can have a huge impact on the Ukrainian literature inside the country.
Yeah, thank you, Andrey. I also, it's like you mentioned, the novel is just, it's just wealth of information and so many families intertwined and so many details. Like you mentioned, Andrey, you know, just the very multi-ethnic, various ethnic groups and countries are displayed. And this part of the world, many parts of the world, of course, you know, stereotypes lead to a lot of conflicts. And my question to Vasyl, to the author of the novel, is you don't seem to focus on ethnic conflicts in this book. And you managed to avoid stereotypes when writing this book. Now, how were you able to, how difficult was it for you as a writer to avoid falling into stereotypes when writing about so many different ethnic groups?
Thank you, Mark. Yes, in Eternal Calendar, I depict many ethnic groups because the land called Galicia. During a long history of Galicia, we Ukrainians have lived in communities with Turks, Jews, Armenians, Austrian, and of course of Poles. I remember in one of my essay, I talked about Galicia, mentioning that Austrian and Poles lived in their own state, Jews live in their own books, and we Ukrainians live in our own land. Yes, it's a metaphor, but it holds some of truth. Of course, stereotypes and conflicts exist between each ethnic groups. From my perspective, I wanted to portray multicultural life according to real historical events beginning from 17th century to present day. In many pages of my novel, I show different religions, different calendars, and different places. They are events waiting to be unfolded on the few cities of Galicia, Chortkil, Buchach, and Metnitsa, the small village, Jerusalem, Istanbul, and finally in New York. I wanted to incorporate in interconnected local and global history. Going back to stereotypes, I think this assumption of that people create in their mind about diverse groups are in part of a collective and self-awareness. That's why my task as a writer was to showcase this complicated life on this area of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. And as Andrey mentioned, you know, and we learned from the reading that you're covering different eras. Two parts of the novel take place in the 20th century, which is a century you are, as a writer, are more comfortable writing about, and obviously 21st. But the first part takes part in the 1600s. So my kind of a follow-up question to you, Vasyl, about writing the novel. How different was it writing about the 1600s that it was about the 1900s? Was it more difficult? Was it a different approach? Did you use a different rhythm? Did you find yourself, you know, the lexicon? Was it any different, or was it just, or was it the same for you?
No, it's a different. This is a long text. It's an epic story. And I described a very important change of my own language of writing. I will not hide the fact that the first two parts of the novel were significant to write about because it's an ancient part of history needed to be further studied from a closer lens. That's why I even visited Istanbul and Jerusalem twice. It's clear to the rhythm of phrases of richness of sentence and vocabulary had to be more or less adapted to be described epoch. It was a not simple process due to having to spend a lot of time studying and reading, where I ordered books, dissertation, and articles of the certain topics. This applied to the first or second section denoted in 1672 and 1916. Although the temporal dimension varied, there are no well-defined boundaries. The sources were publications in different languages: Ukrainian, English, Polish, Serbian, Russian, German, Turks, and Yiddish. I had to consult with specialists and turn to translators from languages I do not read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's colossal work.
Yeah, a lot of work.
Yes. I want to remind our listeners that you can pose questions to us in the chat, and then I will be able to read them to our panelists. Here's a question for Andrey and also for Vasyl. Maybe get the discussion going. Andrey, you talked about the importance of this prize, and that there's so many works written about Ukrainian-Jewish relations, and that they're written now, and that there's so many qualified candidates for these prizes. My question to you and to Vasyl, how much do you think the Maidan and the current war between Russia and Ukraine, how has that affected Ukrainian-Jewish relations? Has that been a reason for some of this interest and for exploring this relationship, of learning each other's stories, as Natalia worded it? So the Maidan and the present war with Ukraine, how has that affected Ukrainian-Jewish relations?
Well, Maidan and Euromaidan affected Ukrainian literature, first of all, and it made Ukrainian literature maybe less poetic, more militant, and more politicized. So, I mean, Ukrainian writers who were in principle apolitical as a protest to the Soviet Ukrainian literature became very political. And actually, politics has a lot to do with history. So in this sense, actually, Ukrainian writers started looking back at Ukrainian history and also at Ukrainian Jewish relationship and at history of Bogdan Khmelnytsky's time, for example. Yeah. And I think the situation which became more critical politically made the writers more responsible and also probably more ready to take up more complicated projects and more complicated and more, I would say, controversial sometimes stories. I mean, like this, the stories of Babi Yar, the tragedy of Babi Yar, which is probably the biggest tragedy, Jewish Ukrainian tragedy on the Ukrainian territory.
Thank you. Vasyl, would you like to comment?
Yes, I think that Maidan, the first revolution and second revolution, in my point of view, that change world vision on the Ukraine and contemporary political process inside Ukraine. Of course, this interesting, that world interesting, there are many countries or many ordinary people looking on the map, where is the Ukraine, where is the Kyiv. It's very it's a new process for the contemporary Ukrainian history, and in that process, including literature, because literature it's a case of cultural exchanges, and I think that process started in writers, in writing, and if, for example, in Bucharest founded that Agnon Center and writers residence, and then that interesting of Agnon's work, Agnon's creative works that in Ukraine right now it's deeply and deeply. I think that we on the start a process between changing Ukrainian Jewish relation and starting the process that new Ukrainian authors will be write about our complicated history.
Thank you. Yeah,
if I can add
yes,
a
please.
couple of words, I wanted to say that actually these events also made Ukrainians much more interested in the history of Ukraine and in Jewish history of Ukraine.
Sure.
And there are lots of new museums and exhibitions started. And the local activists, for example, in small shtetl, in small towns, which were Jewish towns in all times, and now actually they are ordinary towns, they started recreating Jewish history of their places, like Shargorod in Vinnytsia region. And people there, I mean, they're Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians, are trying sort of to create museums and create tours for tourists, I mean, the places of interest based on the Jewish history of Shargorod and of similar towns. And it will be reflected in the literature, no doubt.
Thank you, Andrey, for those important details. Vasyl, you mentioned that you traveled to Jerusalem several times in researching this novel, and I know over the years that you have you talked about literature about this possibility for exchange. I know you've worked with Jewish writers in the past and have been translated and have translated. So, question to both of you. How active is this participation between Jewish writers, contemporary Jewish writers and contemporary Ukrainian writers? Is that something that is really, something that's really established already and moving forward, or is it something that is in a developmental phase? So translations, get-togethers, presentations. Can you comment on that dynamic?
This question for me?
For both or either of you, yes.
Okay, that's yes. A couple of years ago, probably 2015, or I got fellowship or grants from Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. I visit first time is Israel and Jerusalem. And I have a reading at Jerusalem University. That audience was a Slavic department of this university, and young people who interested in that some Slavic cases or Slavic history, Slavic literature. When I visited Israel, I met many Israel writers, and after that, my book, my first book was translated in the Hebrew. It's a book of poetry, and I know a couple of Israel authors, and I know that some Israel publishing houses interested for Ukrainian literature, and we have some interesting translators who knows both languages, Ukrainian and Hebrew. That process probably we began that cooperation between Ukraine and Israel culture, because that process is not easy.
Well, I want to add that there is a cultural exchange and literary exchange between Israel and Ukraine, but it is probably only in the beginner's phase. We have translations from Hebrew. I mean, Ukrainian readers can read Edgar Keret and some other Israeli authors. But I wish Arsenal or Book Forum would invite Israel as a guest country with a larger group of Israeli authors to be presented in Ukraine. There are many personal contacts between Ukrainian authors and Israel authors. I have now a common project with a film director, Ari Folman, who just finished animation film Looking for Anna Frank. And I'm sure there are other projects between Ukrainian authors and representatives of culture of Israel. But I think we need more connection. And I hope that this prize will also push this cooperation further.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I have a couple words to add. That in July, we together with Andrey, we was participant in the first international Agnons Literary Festival that organized by Agnon House in Jerusalem, in the first step to make waving of dialogues between our cultures.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. We briefly mentioned that in your in the introduction, your biography. And getting back to that biography, and getting back to the novel itself, Vasyl, we mentioned it's an epic work. It's wealth of details, and we talked about the different time periods and the different cultures that are and ethnic groups that are covered in it. My question to you is, how? I don't know if we mentioned in the introduction. No, we did not. Where you hail from? Yeah, right. This is this is where you are from. You were born in the region where the novel takes place, and of course that is a very important factor in this. So, could you please comment on that and how big a part of taking on this topic was the fact that this is your native corner of the world, and would you be able to write a novel like this in a different part of Ukraine, that a historical novel took place in Odessa or in Kiev region or Lviv or somewhere, or Donetsk or somewhere else?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question for me. Yes, I deeply understand my native region. I was born in Chortkiv, it's Galicia, and Bucha, Chortkiv, Yazlivets is very familiar for me, this place. I understand this psychological of people and history, local history, language. It's a normal. I think that's normal. Could I write about other parts of Ukraine? I think so. Because as a teenager, I lived in Eastern Ukraine for several years in industrial center of Kryvyi Rih. It's Eastern Ukraine, of course. As for New York, perhaps I will try to write such a novel. Also, the last chapter on the third part of New York is present in Eternal Calendar. Before my novel, I published several short stories about New York. Okay, so maybe someday I will write a novel taking place in New York.
Just as an anecdote, this idea of this eternal and perpetual calendar, and looking at what days of the week in a certain year coincided. I did a little bit of investigating myself, and I can say that October 14th, apparently in the years past, in 1066, William the Conqueror defeated the British at the Battle of Hastings on this day. In 1933, Nazi Germany withdraws from the League of Nations. 1947, Chuck Yeager was the first person to travel the speed of sound. This is not William Shatner flying to space yesterday, but this was October 14th in 47. In 1964, on October 14th, Martin Luther King gets the Nobel Peace Prize. And very interestingly, in 1990, in on October 14th, sadly, Leonard Bernstein dies in New York City. And of course, we know that his parents are Ukrainian Jews from the Rivne region. So the calendar, it keeps turning. Andrey, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned, and we talked a little bit about the Maidan and the war, and you mentioned about the new literature and the politicized literature, more militant literature. We know that you have recently published a novel that deals with the war in Ukraine now. It's called Gray Bees. We mentioned it. Can you maybe say a few words about that and why you decided to take that topic on recently in your writing?
Well, in fact, I was not going to write this novel. And when many of my colleagues started writing about Donbass, and I was asked by journalists if I am writing something, I would answer that I will wait until the war is over, and then sometime longer to understand better what was happening and then to write. But what happened, we suddenly, after the beginning of the war in Donbass, we had an influx of refugees in Kyiv. And at some point, every 10th car in Kyiv had Donetsk number plate. And I started meeting these people who actually were young entrepreneurs, middle-class people who moved to Kyiv and tried to survive. And they were talking about what they think about things happening there. And one of the young businessmen who started a cafe near Kyiv, he told me that he is going to Donbass almost every 2 months with his car, and he is visiting a village in gray zone where only 7 families stay, and they don't want to leave, and they are trying to survive there, and they have their allotments, and they're growing vegetables and pickling them, and so he was bringing them medicines and what they needed, and was taking from them their small production to sell in Kyiv. And this conversation actually shocked me, and I understood that actually thousands of Ukrainians are left in gray zone between positions of Ukrainian army and positions of separatists and Russian volunteers and Russian officers. And they don't have any infrastructure, any help. And from both sides, they are visited by different people. So they have to survive and to smile to everybody. So I decided to write a novel about people from the gray zone. And my main character, retired miner and beekeeper, he is one of 2 inhabitants of a village in the novel. And he actually, in the beginning of this war, he thinks he is defending his bees. He is trying to understand what is happening because he doesn't understand the reason for the war. And slowly, this knowledge and understanding comes to him. And so I just wanted to give voice to civilians who got caught in the war and who actually just lived where they lived all their life, and suddenly the war came to them. They didn't go to fight anybody, just the war came to them and changed their life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, and it's true. I finally was able to go to Ukraine after about 2 years because of COVID. This summer I went, and I know Vasyl recently returned. And you do notice how many books now are being published. So walking into a bookstore, how the topics that are covered in books. But I wanted to ask the two of you also on another kind of dynamic that I noticed. Maybe it's not true. Maybe it's just something I thought I noticed. But it seems to me in bookstores, looking back from a pause of 2 years, that 2 years ago, more prominently displayed on center areas were books by Ukrainian authors 2 years ago, whereas now there seems to be that space has been taken over more by Ukrainian translations of authors from out the world. Did you notice that as well? And it seems like the Ukrainian authors, both classical, contemporary, have a section now, but in 2 years, it seems, we could look at it different ways. It could say like, oh, maybe there's less interest in contemporary Ukrainian authors, or you could say that there's so many wonderful translations coming finally into Ukrainian language of all these worldly books that hadn't been published before. Any comments on that dynamic? Did you notice that? Or
I noticed the same even several years ago, but I also remember that 10, 15 years ago, Ukrainian readers didn't know anything about world literature. Mm-hmm. And the bestseller lists in New York or in Berlin never coincided with the Ukrainian so-called bestseller lists. But now finally we have excellent translators, and we have publishing houses which are buying rights legally from the agents and from the publishing houses abroad to bring the best foreign literature to Ukraine. But I cannot be silent also about the other reason. The other reason is that Ukrainian book market is underdeveloped. And for Ukrainian writers, it is extremely difficult to survive on the royalties from sales of their books. And that's why they have less stimulus to write and to work harder. They have to earn money, and they write columns and they are teaching, etc. So they are writing less than if they would write if the situation with book sale was more stable. So the average print run in Ukraine, even for a famous author, is like 2,000 copies, and it will take probably 2 years to sell them. So there are two reasons, and one of them is definitely positive, that Ukrainians read and know more about world literature today.
I deeply understand this tendency. I remember many years ago, I asked my Israel colleagues, that writer who lives in New York, Ruby Namdar, the prose writer, and I asked him about what right now is the present on Israeli book market. And he told me, yes, it's a 40 or 50%. It's translated from another languages. Yeah, it's for me, it's a unexpected information. Okay, wow. But there's tendency in Ukraine, according to Andrey, yes, it's a chance to read world literature, but I think that for Ukrainian authors, it's a problem, because that many of Ukrainian books is not publishing and not reading and not circulation around literary circles. It's I don't know, it's 50-50 for me. It's a very good, but it's a problem and challenge for Ukrainian authors.
But can I also throw in my 5 cents that it is also even this dramatic situation for Ukrainian authors, challenging situation, is positive, because now Ukrainian authors understand that they have to compete with Paul Auster, with Orhan Pamuk, with Edgar Keret, with world writers. And so it will force them to write better and to tell stories more compelling and more interesting. Yeah. I believe in it.
No, that's a very good point. Yeah, and of course, the Ukrainian language always wins when something's translated into Ukrainian, because new ways of phrasing things and saying things in Ukrainian are developed, which then writers can use for their own works. And we should probably add that many writers are also translators, so they're competing against themselves on those shelves in these Ukrainian bookstores. So. But it's good to see that the book market, at least things are being published, and these wonderful translations and wonderful works by contemporary writers like the two of you. We should be wrapping up soon. I wanted to ask Natalia about the prize. So we mentioned that the first prize was received by Vasyl Makhno for a fiction work, and so it alternates every year, nonfiction, fiction.
Yes, because it's a new prize, and it is maybe more of a niche topic. We're not looking at general fiction. The decision was made to alternate the years, and I think that it's a good decision to do it that way, because the first 2 years we were looking at it was open for books published the previous 3 years. Now it will be the previous 2 years. And the nonfiction category is a little bit wider in terms of the books that are covered. And the rules are available on our website, both in English and in Ukrainian for those people who are interested. But I have to say that I myself, as Pan Andrey was saying, I mean, I was really, in both years, I've been so pleasantly surprised at the number of works that have been submitted and the number of sort of different topics that are looked at within the Ukrainian Jewish topic. And I think this shows the development of Ukraine as a multi-ethnic society, that people are interested, and writers and publishers are interested in the Ukrainian Jewish topic. And I think next year we will also, it goes back into the fiction category. And I know right now that there will be a very fierce competition in that category. So I look forward, because it's a learning experience for me as well to see what is out there.
Excellent, excellent. That sounds good. All right. I think, does anybody want to add anything else before we wrap up? No? Yes.
I would like to add one, to follow up again on what Pan Andrey had said. It's several years ago, Katerina Babkina, we had a conversation with her in Jerusalem, because we had supported the translation of her poetry into Hebrew. And as she was talking to the Israeli participants and reading her poetry, she was telling me that later people had come up and they said, how is it that you understand our experience here in Israel? How do you understand our war experience? And Katerina says, well, I'm not writing about you and your emotions. I'm writing about Ukraine and the emotions of Ukrainians. And so right there, in this, how do you survive with, those individuals or those countries who don't want you necessarily to exist as a state? That is something that already Israeli and Ukrainian writers, that they share. And I think that although war is perhaps, not the most, not the best way to have a relationship or to see what one feels. But the reality is that we do see these shared experiences, shared emotions between Ukrainians and Jews and Ukrainians and Israelis. And I think that that is just going to grow.
Wonderful. Thank you. All righty. Well, on that note, I think I would wrap up today's wonderful event. I want to thank Natalia and Vasyl and Andrey for their wonderful presentations today and the reading and the discussion. I'm happy that this will be recorded and we could share this with people who would like to see this in the future, including students of mine. So thank you for your participation. Good luck with your work ahead. And I look forward to seeing your books and your translations in Ukrainian bookstores and in American bookstores soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.